afternoon. My name is Natalie Nelson. I'm the director here at the Penn's Gallery. I'm so excited to see so many supporters of Gina and Hearne's work. Some of you, it may be your first time to the Penn's Gallery, so I'm really excited you're here. Some of you may be members and have been here many times. So I thank you so much for your support. Penn's is a nonprofit art gallery, and it's through things like membership and donations that we help keep the Penn's going and doing wonderful exhibits like this. So if you can give today, we do ask if you can give a donation of $10 for the lecture, that would be great. You can either do it in the cash box, which is just to your right, or at the front desk through a card. So thank you so much. I also wanted to thank the sponsors for the exhibit. All of our exhibits are sponsored, and we have some wonderful board members to thank. Rosa Marquez and her husband Yotish Misra, as well as Tom Doyle and Kathy Joseph sponsored this exhibit. And Fragments is obviously a two-person show, which is up a few more weeks, so if you do want to see it, it extends through April 2nd. And just to tell you a little bit about the format of the talk, we talked amongst the three of us, and we thought it would be great to have kind of some general questions posed to both of them. Either one can answer, rather than doing it kind of a strictly lecture format with one of them speaking and then the other speaking and then questions. So we'll kind of mix it up a bit. We are asking people to definitely ask questions, but to keep to it at the end. I'll kind of open it up for questions. We are videoing. We're not going to video people except for the three of us. We're hoping to share this since they do have quite a few people on the East Coast who couldn't be here. And I just wanted to thank my intern, Amy Markopoulos, for doing this after her finals. So hopefully we can share that with people if you want to share it with friends. And I think that's it for the format. So let me just do short bios about each of the artists we're with today. First on Gina. Gina received her BA from Hamilton College and her MFA from Columbia. And she also got a certificate from the New York Studio School. She has had her work featured in numerous exhibits in the US and abroad. Recent solo exhibits include the Combs Gallery at American University in Paris, the Corn Gallery at Drew University, New Jersey, Prince Street Gallery in New York City, and the Mondavi Winery in Napa. She has been awarded residencies at the American Academy in Rome, the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and Yosemite National Park. In 2017, she completed a multi-panel public art commission called Clearing for the Burnett Miller Park in Sacramento, which we'll talk a little bit about. She, of course, has taught for over 20 years at the University of Davis as a professor of art, recently retired. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And Hearne Pardee is a painter based both in New York as well as Northern California. He was educated at Yale, where he was influenced by the teachings of Joseph Albers. He spent a year in Yale's fifth-year BA program doing ethnobotanical research and making paintings and drawings in the South Pacific. He studied at the New York Studio School, where he absorbed the approach of Hans Hofmann, which he began to apply to paintings made on site in New York. He received his MFA from Columbia, where he studied with art historian Meyer Shapiro and did research on Romanesque sculpture. He has exhibited at the Bowery Gallery in New York City since 1980. He's shown at Adler & Co. in San Francisco, the Alex Bolt Gallery in Sacramento, the Wigan Gallery in Belmont, and numerous venues across the University of California. And he, of course, has also recently retired from UC Davis, teaching for over 20 years. Both art and art criticism. So that's our wonderful intro. And to get to some questions, and we do also have, I guess I would love to start with a question on college education, just because being in a college town, we're immersed in it, we have interns, I have a kid in college. For both of you who study at the New York Studio School, how did that help you kind of begin your work and develop your voice? Like what was your training there, and how did that help you kind of develop who you are as an artist?
Well, I should say, in terms of, advising people whose kids are in college, I gave my parents nightmares because they never expected me to be an artist. And I gradually turned in that direction as I went through undergraduate. And then I finally went to the studio school after I graduated from Yale, because I applied to Yale and they said, oh, we don't prepare our undergraduates for our graduate program. You're not going to get in. And one of my teachers there said, you should go to the studio school. They take your kind of painting seriously. I was trying to paint like Cezanne. I was very influenced by Impressionism. Wanted to paint outdoors, but I never really did it. And so the studio school turned out to be a great place because there were a variety of teachers there, and I was taught to paint from observation of the model, which Yale, well, they sort of paid allegiance to that, but they were much more interested in the current art scene. And so I had a teacher there who was very good. I mean, he told me the first couple of days, he said, oh, I see what your problem is. And I said, I have a problem. And I was trying to paint like Cezanne. Everything I did looked like Cezanne. I had a model, and it looked very elongated, like one of Cezanne's bathers. He said, well, look at that model. She's not like that at all. And so this was kind of a revelation. I really had to really start from the beginning. And so we learned basic things like that, but also there was this influence of Hans Hofmann and the abstract expressionists who taught us about not seeing the model as just a thing, but also like a space, that the model existed in space. And that was also very revelatory, and it took me a couple more years to get to that. So that's kind of informed all my work since then, including the work I've done with these dancers that I did recently in New York. It's about the idea of moving to space.
So Hearne and I met at the New York Studio School. It was his last year and my first year. But I think what really stuck with me is being a workaholic. We were basically in our studios all the time, and we were surrounded by peers who worked all the time. Everybody says, oh, you have all this free time now that you're retired, but that was our day job. So, and I think, kind of piggybacking on what Hearne said, I think what's stuck with each of us is that balancing between figuration and abstraction. And, I don't know, I guess we're fourth generation New York School type of people. So.
Makes sense.
Well, and also, I do want to thank Natalie for the show, and the Pence, and our sponsors, who we dearly love, but are not here today.
Yes, you're welcome. It has been a real delight. I think one thing I told both of them was I've never done this show. I've done so many shows over almost 19 years, but this is my first show with a couple. And my first thought was, oh no, I know them individually. I don't know them as a couple. And they were so great and so supportive to each other. And I love seeing that, as well as now they have really a shared space. They have their own space, but within a kind of larger space. So it's been really delightful, I think, to hear from both of you more about your training and to get more into their work. And I think I first met Gina, she was on my hiring committee for the Pens. So that was a long time ago. And her and I met shortly thereafter. So definitely. One thing I was interested in too was how people who move to Davis a lot of times, especially from the East Coast, if they're from New York City, they experience this kind of vacuum, like, oh, what do I do now? That there's that quiet, in Yolo County, if you live here, what do I do now? Kind of, where am I connecting? And especially when you moved 20 years ago, Sacramento's gotten better, but it's still kind of quiet. So when you moved from, I guess it was Connecticut to Davis in the early 2000s, that was a big jump, obviously. How did that physical change affect your choice of subject matter, your materials, kind of your points of view, or did it?
Well, for me, it was a shock. We were living in Connecticut, and I was painting plein air landscape, and I was particularly focused on still bodies of water. I mean, it really leads into the abstract work I'm doing now, but I was devastated when I moved here. It was flat, there was no water, and so that was a really big shock. And, just moving a then young family across the country, I think we both had always had this romantic idea of moving to or being in California. And our only experience had been the Jurassic Foundation. as fellows, and if anyone knows that location, Davis is nothing like that. So we overlook Neil Young's ranch, actually Young's cows grazed on the terrace.
Yeah, I had the same thing. We were both started out pretty much, well, I kind of got Gina into working for landscape. I started doing that when I was at the studio school, and I brought Gina out with me actually, and she was willing to do it as long as we were out there together on the Bowery or somewhere. And so I had to adjust, but I was getting more and more into looking at more rural landscapes, not just cityscapes, and especially interested in what I was beginning to call the everyday landscape. And I was interested in art history, and I had been looking at early 20th century American modernism, and Alfred Stieglitz and William Carlos Williams said that American artists had to look away from Europe and look at the local, figure out how to relate, how to see the the basic things that you are familiar with every day, and not just try and impose, like I was trying to impose Cézanne on the model. You don't impose France on California. So this was an exercise in really focusing on that, moving all the way to a very new environment, and then dealing with the suburbs, which was a big thing. I got very involved with that, actually.
And in Connecticut, did you focus at all on that kind of subject matter, the suburbs and houses and
Schools.
I've always painted schools. Yeah, the high school and then Storrs, Connecticut. I did a big, worked on it forever, and then nobody really liked it.
It's like there's a horizon line, but it doesn't appear to be the same coloration as a landscape. But I love how you both have kind of an immersive view of what that is, whether it's landscape or figuration. Is there a sort of different internal process you use when you're doing something abstract versus when you're working from a reference, like a fishbowl and a rock, versus, I don't know, with Gina making one of these or Hearne the one over to your right?
Well, I guess in my case, I'm still going back. Gina's pretty much working very abstractly.
Yeah.
I start with things I look at. I always feel like I want to have some reference to begin with. And so there's a deliberate thing. I think a lot about why am I doing what I'm doing. I was thinking, I woke up this morning, how am I ever going to explain to people why I'm doing this? Make sense of all the different things. We didn't really put this together as a way of, surveying my progression from one thing to another, or putting one thing. It's kind of, but that's the way it is. I work on one thing one day and one thing another day, and so kind of. But I think I'm always bringing the same kind of interest in, pretty much the way things relate on the plane, colors and shapes and placement, that kind of architecture of the two-dimensional surface. That's what
Okay, so it doesn't matter as much the subject as much as
right.
the positioning of the colors and the shapes
Yeah.
within the space.
And
Okay.
just to correct Hearne's comment about my process, you do, in some cases, start with a reference, like the big frame painting over there is based on a beloved Renaissance ceiling in Rome. Now I'm working on a series of painters based on newspaper clippings of contemporary dance. So, and I think you made reference to it, our older son, who's an architect now, we've saved a lot of his childhood drawings, and I will often use those to start a painting. I haven't lately, but.
Yeah, but there is kind of a reference, but it could be maybe something more in terms of memento or a theme versus an observation. Okay, that makes sense, right? I'm trying to think, like, is there something do you prefer to start like with something like a reference, or does it matter? Because you were saying you prefer to start with something you see.
I do. I think pretty much I'm always starting from something, an actual drawing or painting that I already started outdoors, or something that I remember.
Okay. Whereas for you, it could be either. Okay. Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, I should say, I guess you mentioned these bowls with rocks that I started doing.
Yeah, I love
That's,
those.
kind of,
That gets to another question.
okay, so we'll get to that first.
Okay. I was curious too about, in terms of materials, artists work with a lot of different materials nowadays, and both of you have worked with paper quite a bit. And I know when I first met Hearne and saw his studio, it was like, I think that the first time I went was like 2010, and there were all these little bits of paper on the ground, and there's a great photo of him working where it's like literally littered, and he paints those all and cuts them, and you'll see little pinpricks, so he puts them on his paintings and kind of decides where you want them to go. So I know paper is important to you, and I know, Gina, you've referred to your son's drawings and sometimes cards. I know you said like that you found from when you were a kid. So how does paper kind of figure into your paintings? Because I was saying, you know, I don't consider either one of you kind of collagists.
Well, I was thinking, you know, less about collage and more the kind of freedom I feel when I'm doing paintings on paper, you know, as large as this. But I've let collage sneak into my work in the last few years, and you know, it's very different from how I think you highlight it. For me, I like to embed it. You know, at the opening reception, people were coming up to this painting in particular. Wait a minute, what's in it? So I like that slow looking, or that, you know, slow discovery in a way.
Absolutely. And sometimes there's so many layers too, so it might be under, you know, a swish of paint and then some spray paint, and whereas you're seeing a little bit more like I cut it and it's right there.
Yeah, I like you mentioned, I took this Joseph Alber's color course. That was the first course I took in art seriously at Yale as an undergrad, and that got me interested. It was basically you put one color next to another and see how they change, and it was totally abstract. I had really no idea how this related to art. I was just thought, well, I'd written a paper in my French class about color, and the teacher liked it, so I said, well, maybe I should think more about color. And then I started looking, and suddenly I saw paintings that I thought were just pictures of things, that they were actually compositions with color. And I looked at Matisse and Paul Klee and Cezanne, and so that was the thing that started me off. And so I go back to that. I have these photographs in the back wall there that I've been taking around the neighborhood, where I look at the sidewalk and the things people do with their lawns, and create these little either Japanese type gardens or things like that. And then I've added these colored papers, which is very much what we did in one of the projects in the color class, which was called the Betzel effect. If you put light colors on one side and dark colors on the other side over a uniform background, the background gets darker under the dark colors and lighter under the light colors, which is kind of the opposite of what simultaneous contrast tells you what you do. So I'm loosely using that. I just like it as a kind of way of marking things, I guess, and kind of bringing out colors. I mean, these photographs, I haven't done like reprographics here on campus, and the colors are not very good, but I thought, well, I can use that, you know, so, you know, it's kind of brownish or grayish, and then you can enhance that. I think I use the colors collage more as a kind of correction, getting something else to happen.
We had a lot of school children through here, and that was their biggest question was, what are the squares? That's what one little boy
I got
said.
a comment in the book, I don't like the squares.
Yeah, one little boy said, and you can tell it was handwriting. Yeah. Which, you know, it's always fun to hear what they have to say, but some of them thought it was like a walking path or a hopscotch that they could follow along, kind of like you see at schools. So they definitely were intrigued by them. I think it's, again, like with a lot of people, you want to find out, like, what is the interpretation? And sometimes it's many things, like you said, it's the Basel effect, it's all these different things you're trying, as well as kind of situating somebody in the landscape. Like with some of those, you can see your shadow.
Right, yeah, I got
Which is
myself in
neat.
there.
Yeah.
We have a self-portrait.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of reference yourself.
I also was thinking about how differently we approach collage or the use of cut paper. Hearne's pieces are all very geometrical, architectural, and it echoes, I think, the difference in our work in a way. Mine are like, when I first started using collage, I was like, oh my God, I don't have to keep it to exact squares or whatever shape.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I know sometimes yours kind of reiterate, it seems like architectural shapes that you're looking at in the environment. But I know once you told me that sometimes they are random, like they're literally the chips fall wherever they fall on the ground and see kind of what happens. Just always need to play with chance.
Right, yeah, you can do things, choose what color you want and how many pieces, and then just let them fall.
Yeah. Yeah, and then decide, okay, I'm gonna put this one here or not. One interesting thing that I saw in the public art that both of you did in McKinley Village was I saw the little the squares in your piece, which Hearne did this really interesting table, and I believe there was a bench where it had that color patterning. And it was interesting to see their work in 3 dimensions, since you're both, 2D artists. And Gina, it was almost like her painting was kind of exploded. I don't know if anyone's seen it here, but it kind of provides a frame. You look through it, you can walk around it. So it's really interesting what they've done.
It's, I think we ended up with 5 or 6 pieces.
Is that right? Okay.
We exploded. The painting was the size of the little one here.
Oh, really? It was that small?
Yeah.
Like a little 12
We
or 12?
blew it up to whatever the company in Santa Rosa could do, and I think it was 6 by 6.
But it looked very indestructible. In public art, of course, you have to put it out there, trying to make it, impervious.
And the funny thing is, we mentioned earlier that I used our son's drawings as a kid. He and I worked together on my public art exhibition.
Oh, that's really
And it was his idea, why don't we take one of your paintings, Mom, and just explode it? So it's really fun.
That's really neat. I love too where you had a window through the painting so you could see the landscape behind it.
Yeah, the day of the opening, it was really cute. Tipo was still alive, and he was there, and he said, come on, let's walk through it. And there, if anyone's seen it, it's a walking path in this beautiful park. And we get to the end, and there's a little kid about this tall, and he's perched inside of the window. It's really great.
So he was kind of framed.
Yeah. But I mean, just that sense that somebody can experience my work by walking through it is really fun. It's a great place for selfies, by the way.
Yeah. That sounds really neat. What was your experience in seeing your piece? Was it like, wow, I can't believe it's here?
Yeah, because this was another one, it was rather small and we made it very large and used this printing on porcelain kind of stainless steel and enlarged everything, even the little holes that they were still visible in this painting which I made with some collage, and I moved things around and those are very visible. But the idea of my work was that I did a painting with some collage on it, and then I took the colors and made a strip of colors on the bottom that kind of referenced the colors in the painting. And then we had this table, since this was a little park, and I got ceramic tiles and made a composition on the surface of the table that was basically transposing the colored grid from the painting onto the table. So
I love that. One thing I was curious about too was both of you have had your artwork produced as other kinds of objects. Like, so it's that kind of second to the right, I guess, from the corner, that big frame piece that you referenced, which I still want to see that, how they did the text and everything. And then you've also had things produced like rugs and silk scarves. And is that strange to see somebody like wearing your painting? I mean, it's not the same, but is it?
Well, I think the rug was the biggest
Was
surprise.
it? Okay.
Because the one they made is 9 by 12 feet. And the painting, which is owned by Wolf, who's here, is 22 by 30 inches. And, they ended up hiring actually a former part-time professor that we had hired at Davis to work on the project in LA. And the rug was hand woven in Nepal. And she made decisions about, and this woman, Sarah, was also an artist. And she just appeared with her
Wonderful.
Sarah, I'm talking about you.
Fortuitous.
The rug. And Sarah was communicating with the weavers this in the fall by taking a section to do the matching. And Sarah made a very interesting decision, I can't believe you're here, of what to make wool versus silk. So, just that tactile experience when we actually, it took about a year for the rug to be made, and to walk on it and feel the difference was really interesting.
That's kind of like the experience with the little boy, kind of immersing yourself into the painting, but through a more tactile means.
I think there are extra chairs up front here, I don't know.
Yeah, right here too.
Oh, here's one over here. Another question I had was on movement, because both of you talked about dance and the connection with dance, and early on we had really hoped to have a dance performance here, but you can only do so much. So I said, maybe no dancing right now. But I know in terms of connecting visual arts to the performing arts, both of you have been very interested in that. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that as well as other types of movement and how you see your work reflecting that.
Well, I got into moving more when I was thinking about video, and I was working in one of the parks out in Mace Ranch, and I worked there so much, and I worked at different points of view, so I finally took a video camera and I walked around so I could do a 360-degree view of the whole space, and then I began drawing, watching the video, which of course is very difficult because it's jumping around all the time, and then from that I began to get the idea that I could combine that the important thing was where I was standing and not the not the vanishing point of each time we set up this over a camera, we have like this point in the distance, but rather I think of where we are, we're aware of what's around us all the time. Light is always surrounding us and we're aware of what's behind us, even though we know we can turn and see it. And we're actually, getting ahead of the idea of fragments, I think we're always shifting our viewpoints all the time. I know that this room has many things in it that I won't remember. If somebody asked me, where was so-and-so sitting, I won't remember that, but I know I could find them if I were trying. So I use that idea, and from that, and then working on the floor is the other thing where the choreographer who worked here, Dave Grenke, in the dance department, liked to look at my work and he liked it on the floor. And he said, well, why don't we use these in the theater? And so we made up prints on vinyl of some of my big floor compositions of just paper on the floor. And we put them on the theater, and he had his dancers move around and look at the positions of the colors in the space. And then in the show in New York, we had, of course, with the stuff on the wall as well as the floor, and he had a group of dancers that actually came in and did a short performance.
And for me, I'm a swimmer, and I think the shift from working perceptually into abstraction, I could forget the horizon line and grounding everything. And the big painting back there was kind of my fantasy of what it would be like if I were back swimming in the Mediterranean again, rather than a concrete pool. But that sense of de Kooning's famous comment about a fleeting glimpse, that everything, we're constantly moving and everything around us is constantly moving.
I love that. I'm kind of trying to capture that glimpse in a static object is really hard.
And we both worked with Dave Grenke. I would bring my figure drawing class into his dance composition classes, and it was really great. Our kids had to work really, really fast. And at one point, his dancers started interacting with some of my students who got brave enough to go out into the dance floor. So there was touching, there was just trying to figure out where people were spatially.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and engaging, I guess, the space in a different kind of way rather than on a 2D surface. I was curious too about going back to the teaching when you were talking about the rock and water. Why don't you tell people about the assignment you would give students and why you gave that to them? Because that was my curiosity.
Yeah, well, that's just
what's this water bowl doing here?
I was trying. We had so many Asian students in my classes, and I thought they don't know anything much about Asian art. Actually, I asked them questions, and I don't know, you know. So I said, well, there's this principle in Asian art about rocks and water, you know, the duality of the universe, and well, it also comes through Wayne Thiebaud, because he did a project where he would take a clear glass, actually just a plastic cup, and put water in it and put it on a white piece of paper and make the students paint that. And this was a very beginning plastic, like there's no color. But actually you start working and you begin to realize you can get light to happen. And so I was combining that with the idea of rocks. I said, well, I had to go to the Ace down here in Davis to get rocks. You can't find rocks lying around, except in people's yards. And so you go to a rock yard, you have to buy it by the pound. But I got some nice rocks, and I got things from the still life from just clear bowls, and I put them with the rocks and had the students, you know, make the water problem a little more complicated and have a rock appearing in it. And they did some really interesting things. And then the rocks can become mountains, and you know, you can start getting all kinds of ideas. And so I took it down to my studio, and I said, well, I'm going to try this. And so I got very involved with that. And the bowl and the transparent bowl and the you know, that idea of three-dimensional space, being able to you know, integrate 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions and see more than just the particular viewpoint.
That's great that it started as an assignment and kind of trickled to your studio. And I also remember he has these great trays of butterflies that I think you borrowed, right? And those made it into a couple paintings.
Well, those are my own butterfly collection. I started collecting butterflies when I was very young, and I still have them. They're really in bad shape, but they're okay to draw. You know, colors are still pretty good.
The colors are amazing. Yeah. Let's see. We were talking about the idea too of fragments in reference to our theme, which at first I was worried that the artist would find kind of negative, but the more we talked about it, the more it was like, no, that kind of references something that we both admit, that you can only see so much, we can only experience so much, and in a painting you try to put together an idea of not necessarily something that's complete, but your way of seeing what your experience in the universe is like. So it may be a fragment here, a fragment there. And I had this great quote from Gina's, and this is where I got the brainstorm for the idea of fragment, which was from her 2011 artist statement from an exhibit catalog. Mixing up stuff is the most exciting part of painting for me, a universe that incorporates the seen world as well as fragmentary gestures from memory. Fragments floating in a fluid space intrigued me in contrast to my earlier efforts to bring a landscape into a unified spatial whole. So I really think of like the blue painting she was talking about here with the idea of the Mediterranean, kind of you're floating and all of that. I really like that. So that was kind of where we started with our theme. I hope you guys are still pleased with that one. This one's less of a question since we kind of addressed the theme.
Gina can talk about that.
What fragments?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brought all that up.
No, I think it's interesting because as now Wayne knows, I'm doing a lot with stencils, and I don't want it to be totally complete. Now, just looking at the bright blue painting in the middle there, and I've been, looking around my studio, trying to think about other things I can stencil or trace. And my old studio on campus was near the dumpster where all the design kids would throw out their wood fragments. And I carried this piece that's a funny little arc shape, and when I was painting this morning, I was like, why won't I complete the circle? But I want that glimpse of recognition to be fleeting rather than completed by me. So
in some ways then the visitor can complete it themselves. So it makes it kind of more engaging. I kind of feel that way with some of your architectural paintings too, the ones where you won't quite complete that arch, you'll leave it kind of open.
Yeah, you should always let the viewer. Sometimes you don't have to finish it, you don't have to worry about detail and everything.
Right.
Just put something out there and they will figure,
they'll figure it out.
Mentally,
Yeah. These were challenging because you can see Hearne's here with the two landscapes, and then in the center we have a more abstract piece, but kind of our concept was you could see some of the same shapes that he's looking at in that particular park in Mace Ranch, that is echoed in the more abstract piece. So, yeah, so again, a little bit less detail, but kind of multiple points of view.
That kind of goes back to, it's sort of like the bowl of water. There's this installation out there which I depicted in this, the two paintings where they commissioned an artist from Sacramento when they did the park, and he designed a thing he calls evidence of life, which is a spiral made out of raised earth, and he put stones in different places on it. Winter solstice or the summer solstice, you'll see the sun aligning with the rocks, and it aligns all the way across the park with other rocks. So anyway, I thought this was a good, getting out the everyday suburban landscape and reminding us of our place in the cosmos.
Absolutely.
And so there, again, it's a kind of integration of all the directions into one place.
Well, and you've also painted at this park over the years,
Yeah.
right? Because I know Gina said, that painting he's been working on that a while. So you've seen it with like no landscaping, boring Davis dirt,
Yeah.
and then as the plants kind of grow up around the art installation.
Subsiding into the boring.
Yeah.
dirt.
Well, I don't know. I find it interesting. I know you said sometimes people will comment as you're painting, like, what are you doing? Because we don't have that many, tradition of painting within the city. Maybe on the outskirts in winters, it's more scenic. But I know you love kind of more the schools and the everyday architecture of Davis.
Yeah, there's something about schools that I attract. It's just, it's a place, it's a social scene,
Yeah.
and I'm intrigued.
Yeah, and the playgrounds and all those.
Yeah, and then I was like in integration with children's art. I actually taught some children's art classes a long time ago, and so that's part of the youth pasting little papers. It's kind of
Great.
a kids art project.
Yeah, and in our kids' art program, we've been doing the papers they can paste too, and they do love that. They get more, except for the kid who said he didn't like the squares. They get more into that.
I have students in college who don't like the squares either.
Yeah.
I had one of my students right in when I was going out, and I was drawing a grid on the canvas. Said, "You had a grid on that canvas too?" They grids all the time, and so.
Well, I just wanted to ask another question about color, because we kind of mentioned it with Gina and both you. You have really distinctive palettes, and going into your studios, you really don't use exactly the same colors. I like to think of Gina's as a little bit more pastel, neon. I even have seen some glitter in her work, which is really cool. And then with Hearne's, you have these like really vibrant greens and reds. And I think of them as like primary, but like with some secondaries thrown in. So I was wondering if you both could talk about your choice of palette, because again, sometimes it references real objects, but sometimes you're frankly making it up, or you're creating a feeling.
Well, for me, I think moving from plein air painting with the landscape to a more abstract format was very liberating. Not only could I forget about the horizon line, but I could really play with color. So I remember one of my shows in New York when my mother was still alive. She said, "Your paintings are so bright. How come you always wear black?" People come in here. Somebody was here for the second Friday last week, and they're like, "Your paintings are all so cheerful." I was like, "We're both always so depressed."
I think I started using the colors actually, went back to when I was painting in New York City way back at the beginning, and everything was gray and brown, and I wanted to paint like Matisse, and I kept looking at my paintings and saying, well, I keep looking at it, and of course when you're working from observation, you keep adding, well, no, that's not it yet, and it gets grayer and browner, and so I made up these papers. I just said I'm just going to make up colors I like, and so I did that, and I just had fun making up the colors, and then now I'm going to use them, and I did a drawing on a little panel and put the colors I liked in where the different colors would be in the painting. And so that kind of got me started on this whole color thing.
I remember you said, like, you looked out at the landscape and you were like, I don't want to do any of those colors out there. I want to make my own colors, so the paper could be liberating.
Well, yeah, it's true. But then on the other hand, some colors I really love the earth colors.
Yeah.
The way when it starts to get green in the landscape, I'm like, oh no, now it's green. You know, it just takes one day and all those little green things start
Popping out. It's true. That's true. Let me think. I think the only other question I was going to ask is kind of what's next for both of you? What are you guys excited about? I love to hear what people are kind of planning, because I know you've been going back and forth between posts, and are you planning any big pieces or any new series you can tell us about?
So I have a show in New York opening in early September, so I'm very anxious as we live this strange bi-coastal life. But I've been working in series quite a bit, I think you know, trying to think about dance and movement that each campus can create a kind of stop, you know. So I've been thinking about that. I've also been thinking, like, it's really fun when you have somebody like Natalie come to the studio, and when you visited, we had just moved, we had stuff, you know, packed away. And I love that you picked out those two little works on paper, you know, because they weren't buried. And I've been thinking more about really playing with radical shifts in scale and seeing what happens.
I love that. Yeah, especially because those are so intimate.
Yeah. I also want to get back to more movement in the paintings. I don't know, I've been playing with bits of tape and measuring, and now I'm like, oh, damn it, I want to get out of that.
I love the photos you sent us of you working with, a lot of times the paper pieces are on the ground, so she's moving all over and she's really active, and so it really is almost like a dance with you engaging with the paper and of course the paint.
Yeah, I think a good friend of ours who's not here today said, what about your back?
It's true, because you're bending over a lot.
But it goes back to that experience of the rug, about, you know, being on the work on the floor, particularly on this scale. You know, it just changes. I in my old studio on campus, I would have probably 6 or 7 of them going at once. So, you know, not exactly like Pollock, but I'd have a bunch of paint and put it in all different pieces. So that kind of simultaneous series working is interesting to me.
It's interesting because you could see definitely connections between the pieces that you were doing together. Yeah. How about you?
Oh, I don't know. I'm just hoping everything's going to fall into place somehow. Right now, I feel like I've got all these things. I'm hoping to do something more with working with the idea of movement, and then using the floor pieces and printing things out on a larger scale. I kind of like doing that, but then I have paintings. Well, I say that's the main thing. That kind of would pull everything together if I could do that. But exactly what particular things I'm going to do in the transition, I don't know.
Okay.
Still doing little paintings outdoors.
I like that. So is that something you vary in between doing kind of plein air outside with more studio-based work?
Yeah, I go back. I got another bowl of water in the studio. I'm working on that too. You just got to keep it all going and hope that somebody see it all. It's gestalt, you know.
Right.
And so then you'll do your final.
For all the anxiety when we had to move out of the campus studio a year ago, Hearne was like, how am I going to set that up again?
Right?
I was like, well, becomes hard.
But you had your portable, space.
I had a lot of pieces of paper.
A lot of stuff. It's true. No, it was really interesting, I think, because when you go into an artist studio, you can a lot of times see the diversity of work, and sometimes they won't show you what they've been working on. They'll just pretend. They just do one kind of work, and then you'll see, like with her, oh my gosh, he does still life, he does this, he does a lot of different kinds of things. So we don't have a huge space, but we wanted to include a little of what you do. We didn't include video or dance, but he does that.
Oh, I think you did a really good job. I like the way it all, seemed to have coordinated with the different things.
Yeah.
So.
Is there anything else that you want to add before we open it up for questions?
I think one of your questions, you kind of, I made her stop talking about it. Did teaching how did it give back to us?
Yes.
We
I
didn't
think?
talk about teaching that.
Yeah, it's always a two-way street, definitely.
You know, and I feel like I've learned so much from the students, and you know, I think that's the thing I miss the most is I don't miss a lot.
You say that now, parents here.
But just that energy, and you know, I'm trying to open their minds up, and you know, I don't often tell them that there's you know a lot of reciprocity. You know.
Absolutely.
It's been very gratifying with posting on social media, hearing from former students, like, wow. Anyway.
How about you? What do you feel like you got from students?
Oh, well, I've gotten, you get feedback on your ideas by trying to figure out how to communicate to them what you're interested in, and then you see what they do, and it definitely adds a dimension to it.
I remember you said you kind of miss having that dialogue with
Yeah,
students,
yeah.
that back and forth. Yeah, I always loved asking my interns, you know, who were their favorite teachers, and they would mention you guys and say, you know, because you would listen to them and really listen to their ideas.
Yeah, I should mention, I have done writing about art, and they've had me teach some courses that are more like based in art history. And so that's a way to really help. I've developed some ideas, especially about the American landscape and the suburban landscape and things like that, having the students as guinea pigs to go look at things and work
that's fun.
around Davis.
Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of our having moved quite a bit in our adult lives. The studio school was so focused on Western European and New York school, and when we moved to Maine, it was like, oh my God, it's Hartley and Marin, and you know, I think we started writing about Hearne.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Anyway, Brenda's got a question.
Oh, yeah,
some people
questions.
probably don't want us to
Yeah, well,
talk.
first of all, I really want to thank you guys for sharing this with us. It's so wonderful, the paintings here and everything here. I can see a lot of similarity with the work, also a lot of differences at the same time. And when Gina talked about movement and color and her hands, I just wanted to have in your mind too about music. So when I see the word abstraction, remind me Kandinsky talk about music and abstraction and color and line and shape and movement. Will you share that with us?
So, pre-Trump or I don't know, I was always listening to music while I was painting. Now I'm a news junkie. But music is really important to me. And actually, a show I had in Santa Barbara about 10 years ago, the gallerist, I can't remember what musical term she named the show, you remember? Anyway, but it was something to do with how symphonies are organized, so
Polyphony, or is that what that-
polyphony, so that was a good one.
Thank you. How about for you? Hearne?
No, I've always, I play the guitar, I've always been interested in, music and rhythm in particular, and I always feel like if I can get into the groove, and I want that experience in painting where you feel like the colors are all kind of coming together. And the complicated thing with painting is, of course, you also have, if you're trying to work representing something, you have to get all the different things to be the right proportion and fit together. It's a little more complicated, but I find music and that basic rhythmic thing, which I think goes back to Hans Hofmann. He was always about rhythm. Albers, no. Albers, my teacher for the Albers course said he wanted to cut us all off at the neck. He didn't want any grunting and groaning in his class. This was in the early 60s. It was after abstract expressionism, and he was totally opposed to abstract expressionism, so he did not want, and I think it came out of the Bauhaus and Albers too, like the idea of expressionism being connected to nationalism and the totalitarianism. He wanted the intellect and the eye. He said, I want your eye and your brain and nothing else. But then Hans Hofmann, who came out of Germany too, was totally into movement and getting masses of color to move
And
around.
the Bauhaus,
Well, the
definitely,
Bauhaus-
music was very much a
Yeah,
part.
well, sure, they have wanted to integrate everything.
Mary?
At the very beginning, you mentioned, thank you for this, by the way, that paper gave you a sense of freedom. Wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit?
So I've just had this experience of a collector wanting a painting that I thought I had lost during the move, but it turns out I had sold it a year or so ago. And, you know, I think it was actually when Merce Cunningham had come here, and I just had totally fallen in love with Merce Cunningham all over again. And anyway, the painting that was, this is not the first person to like this painting. I think it took me 3 hours to do the painting. There was a freshness to it. And there's something in working in paper where I don't feel as pressured to make something. And I also love the hardness of the surface, you know, that if I'm working on the floor or if I'm working on the wall, you know, I don't know, it just gives me a kind of freedom that I don't always feel I have in the larger pieces. So
I think I get it.
You touched on getting feedback from your students and giving them. Do you critique each other, and if so, how does that go?
It's
very heavy. We had the luxury in 23 years on campus of not sharing a studio. So now, as some of you have seen, we're in very cramped quarters. And Marion, like one of the things I used to do you saw my old studio, one half was work on paper, the other half oils. Now my tiny work on paper studio, I have to climb over Hearne's stuff to get to. And it disrupts the rhythm. But to answer your question, I think we've just been careful in this transitional time to give each other space. But occasionally we do make comments.
Yeah.
I think we did it more naturally when we had separate studios where we would go sometimes for a month or two and not see each other's work. You know, I think when we're getting ready for shows or studio visits, that's probably when
I think both of us wants to avoid getting too directly, down to the, this doesn't look right. Well, we say that to each other too sometimes, but it's not.
we're very sensitive.
This is just because of your long time in education. You must have taught figure drawing. Some of your students must have been interested in portraiture. Either of you had a period where you did the human form as the focus of your work?
Certainly when I was at the studio school, we worked from a model all the time. And when I was throwing out work when we moved, I found some really nice figure paintings that I'd forgotten about. That remember when we lived in New York after we finished grad school.
Where did this model come from?
Remember we used to get together with Rosanna and we'd hire models and they were really nice painted. Anyway.
Yeah,
But sometimes, Nick, I feel like, I think like looking at these photographs of dancers and having seen Peter Ausch at Berkeley a couple of weeks ago, I love the figure and I wish I could figure out a way to incorporate that interest into the work.
Right.
I haven't yet.
I think, Hans Hoffman's classes were always based on model of some kind, but you would go into space and then you would improvise with the spaces and it would become abstracted. So I think there's a sense in which it's related to that figure, but not directly.
And I know that music means a great deal to you and you're a performer. And I wonder whether you play music when you're painting. And also, how do these two arts interact for you? And if you care to answer, could you speak rather loudly, because My hearing is much impaired.
Okay. Yeah, well, I sometimes listen while I'm working, but I don't have a thing about listening to music particularly. In fact, one of the teachers at the studio school, Milton Resnick, who was an abstract painter, said artists should not listen to music. I mean, that was what he said that in one of his lectures, and the students were all outraged, and he, I think, wanted to provoke some kind of response like that. So, but I do I listen to all kinds of things while I work. And as I said before, I think the basic idea is the rhythm is where I feel there's the connection. It's funny because I think there is a rhythm to visual things as much there is to music. And so maybe somebody should write something about that. I think Kandinsky sort of had the idea.
Nick, for me, I love opera, and I can remember when we lived in Maine, I would play La Boheme all the time. And I'd be kind of bouncing around and listening. But, you know, as Hearne said, that sense of the beat and rhythm is really important. And my younger son, in the early days of his having an iPhone, his playlist was on my phone. And he's like, Mom, you're listening to my music. But, you know, anything that gets my hand and eye moving is important to me.
Thank you.
Gina,
Yeah.
I'm noticing in that painting, that painting, that painting, and that painting, that there's a void in the middle. There's a lack of arc. Is that purposeful?
Yeah. It probably came originally from studying that Baroque ceiling painting.
Mm-hmm.
Some people over the years have said, like that painting I was describing that I don't have anymore, that there are some rest stops in it, and I just decided, I think on that one, that I very consciously wanted to have some empty space.
A
So-
design choice.
What?
A design choice, balance.
Yeah.
Mm.
But I am thinking more about rest stops, and they're not intentionally in the center. Good observation.
That's good in music too.
Is it Marianne?
So, Hearne, professors, how do you know when the painting is finished?
Yeah, sure. How do you know when it's finished?
I think Hearne should talk to that.
I don't know. I don't have an answer for, I work on it until I feel like I can't get any more out of it and it's time to move on, or I start something else. You know, usually it's when I get an idea for something else and I start that and I say, okay, now I'm sort of leaving that and moving on. And sometimes I go back and change a little. But I think your attitude towards the painting changes when you start with another group of paintings and then you feel like you can go back and put some final touches and leave it as it is.
Marianne, it might also be that Hearne's freaking out with the little painting here. It's all green, and he started the painting. And I think for me, working abstractly, it's harder to have an external thing stopping me from working. But it's a good question.
I remember this thing from de Kooning. He said, I asked my wife.
And actually, Brenda, going back to your question, do we critique each other? Sometimes since we've been sharing the studio, Hearne got very hurt. He said, well, you said you didn't like that one area. So we went back and sure.
I think we're afraid we're going to tell them to do something and then it's not going to come out that way. We're responsible, So.
I like that though. Yeah, go ahead.
Now that you guys are sharing utility style, are you finding that, it sounds like there's a lot you're trying to figure out still, but do you feel like your work is influencing each other more now that you're in a shared space? Because I get a little sense of that in the work.
It's funny, when we were at the studio school. We were in very separate places in those crazy buildings, but I don't know. Natalie, I think when you first proposed the show to us, and Natalie's first visit, I think you registered a little surprise at how different our work was.
Absolutely.
And I think, Paige, when we were working perceptually, both of us, I think there was a lot more overlap, but I don't know that.
Yeah, I think I'm obviously looking at Gina's work more now that we're working next to each other, and so I think I'm probably absorbing things.
Yeah, sometimes maybe it's somebody else.
Yeah, you think about it.
Not so
I think about
conscious.
it. Gina the other day was complaining I was watching her.
It's awfully forward, but he was American.
Our older son is building us a studio, and he's like, I wish you guys were more social, but you want that wall between you.
You were talking earlier about the role of music and rhythm and art, and in jazz there's this issue of like call and response. That this person plays as you respond. And do artists like you do you do a piece of work that's a response to another piece of work? Or as a couple, have you ever thought about doing a call and response series, like intentionally? Like, I'm gonna create this, and I'd like to interpret it and respond to it.
It's one of the reasons I love jazz, is that improvisational quality, but that's a really nice idea. Maybe now that we're sharing.
Yeah, oh my God.
The idea has crossed my mind occasionally that we could kind of collaborate, but we don't pursue it really.
Actually, Pat Chirapravati, who couldn't be here today, I don't know, Richard, if you remember, Pat had this idea of getting us a show in Singapore. And part of her idea was we were gonna do some kind of collaborative piece together.
You'll just come over here, you'll just make it right here.
Yeah, right in front of the wall, right?
Which would be interesting, definitely.
Other ideas, it's a new direction. Yes, Matt.
You mentioned earlier that when you had a studio on campus, you at one point had more than once, half a dozen pieces on the floor that you were working on simultaneously, maybe with some red that might apply to one piece and then to another, I guess apply it until we ran out of red and we get some color. Did those paintings all trend towards the same end? Or did they sort of assume a ranking where you got one really good one, on down to one that went to dumpster? How did that process produce for you?
Yeah, you
Did
know,
it produce a bunch of uniform stuff that was all
it's one of the
average?
things I worry about when I'm working on several pieces simultaneously. Like, you know,
I'm also.
I love red, a particular kind of red. And sometimes I like looking at a body of work and thinking, oh shit, using that same red over and over again. Like when we were installing the show, one of my worries was these two pieces, they're looking more similar. And the little painting that's on the announcement, the installer originally had it over here, and it's like, oh god, yellow. So I consciously am fighting against that similarity, but it doesn't always work. So some will go to the dumpsters, other I'll keep working on it.
Well, I know you're talking about rest stops in your work, Gina, and I know, often Hearne is painting, well, often indoors in studio or plein air, but not with, I would not say Hearne is like super deep space, so it always feels interesting to me how different you are spatially, even though you are both moving and, sort of consciously working in a pretty active way. So I'm just curious if you have more, either of you have more to say about that.
How did you describe the differences
You mean,
in your spatial?
I feel like your space is more frontal, and Gina's is got more push and pull in a very general way.
I love that push and pull. it's funny, when you have a show, you're, I don't know, I'm constantly critiquing, like, and for me, like, these 3 paintings, they have a shallowness of space that I don't often associate with my work, I guess. And so that's an interesting question. But I think, just that, I think one of the uses for me of stenciling and collaging is it brings things up to the surface and then you can push back with the paint or vice versa. And, the collage just has I put a piece of paper down, I'm like, oh, good, and then I can work against it. It's almost like a kind of elasticity to create that space. But I am contradicting myself because the big blue one in the middle, the collage and the feeling like it's underneath the paint.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe that's a good observation, yeah.
I've always liked grids.
Yeah. Well, so, and, some of these pieces, there's definitely more deep space. So maybe that happened since you moved studios.
There's no possibility of a grid in our current space.
Well,
You can see that.
Well, and if people are interested in the piece that was on the invitation card with the yellow, which is called Fabric, it's a wonderful little piece. It is upstairs in my office. I do have 2 other small Gina pieces that would not fit in here, so if anyone wants to see them, I'm happy to show them to you. Small little abstracts. But I think we're done. It seems like I'd like to thank everyone for their wonderful questions and for coming. You're welcome to stay around. Yeah, thank you so much.